are listening to the Reformand Initiative podcast, where we analyze and discuss Roman Catholic theology and practice from an evangelical perspective. My name is Clay Kennard. I'm sitting here in the city center of Rome with Reed Carr and Leonardo De Chirico. Gentlemen, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
It's a beautiful day in Rome today. It's actually quite warm. I know this time of year it's pretty rainy and cold, but the Lord's blessed us with a beautiful day. And so we're excited to be here in order to bring you a new episode of the Reformand Initiative podcast. And we have a very special episode planned for today. Reed, why don't you tell us what we're going to talk about?
It was just one of those kind of bigger picture episodes that we like to do every once in a while that helps our listeners understand the big pieces of Roman Catholicism and its theology and how that theology is put into practice and lived out. And so today we want to talk about the Papacy, and so the office of the Pope, and just helping our listeners to understand, where did that come from? How is it developed? What does it mean? And how should we understand it as evangelicals? So hopefully it'll be one of the, we did one recently on Mary, kind of a big picture of what the church believes about Mary. And we did that too, also because Leo has written a book on Mary that helps listeners, evangelicals, understand Mary better. And he has done the same with the Papacy. In fact, that was the book he wrote first. It's called A Christian's Pocket Guide to the Papacy, its origin and role in the 21st century. And it's a very readable book. It's on Amazon. You said it's also on Audible?
Yeah, it's also on Audible.
So we'll put that in our notes. But so we'll use that as kind of a guide for this conversation and see where it goes. But maybe we could just start with helping our listeners understand kind of a little bit of the history, Leo, of the Papacy and how far back does it originate. Certainly the Catholic Church would look to Peter as the first pope, but from a biblical understanding, it doesn't seem that Peter understood himself that way, nor did the early church. Certainly, that doesn't suggest that Peter didn't have a role of leadership in the church, but to say that he viewed himself as the first pope of more that would come is a stretch. So, how far back would we go to? How far back does the Papacy date historically?
Well, the Papacy is a child of history, and it stems out of the more of an historical process than biblical reflection and elaboration on what the Bible says. It stems out of the expansion of the role of the leaders in the Church of Rome that began to be seen as not only leading the Church of Rome, but also exercising a wider influence over the wider church. And but biblically speaking, when we read about the history of the foundation or the planting of the Church of Rome, we don't see any evidence of the fact that the church was led by first one bishop only, one single leader. Actually, Romans 16, the chapter in which Paul, before visiting the city and the Church of Rome, writes to them, he mentions a lot of names and people, even couples, and showing a picture of what the Church of Rome looked like at the time when it was planted, but there is no indication of the presence of a single bishop, and not even the sense that the church was founded by Peter. It was founded by anonymous Christians, unrelated to Peter. Actually, when Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, Peter is not even mentioned in the community that Paul is aware of. And so that indicates that, historically speaking, Peter had no role whatsoever in founding the Church of Rome. And the early stages of the Church of Rome did not have a single leader overseeing the church in the city. It was more of a second generation development where we can see that the different churches in Rome growing and becoming bigger than the initial group, they then began to be organized around the presence of elders, bishops, and even in the second generation, these terms were used as synonymous. So not indicating, technically speaking, what we now understand as the role of the bishop as being the higher leader than the elders or the priests or the presbyters. So even in the second generation, we have this interchangeability between terms. But certainly in the third generation, there is a growing process of that shows that the churches, not only Rome, but more broadly, they began to be structured around a more hierarchical pattern. So breaking this interchangeability of terms, but defining more technically the role of the bishop as the highest role in the church, followed by the presbyters or the elders, and then followed by the deacons, and then followed by the lay Christians. And that process then saw the emergence of the role of the Bishop of Rome attached to the fact that he was exercising his ministry in the capital city of the empire, where all the political decisions were made, where all the major events and decisions were carried out. And so the role of the Church of Rome began to be seen as more influential because of the geography and the political geography attached to the city of Rome. But in the Bible, there is no evidence whatsoever that the Church of Rome should have had a prominent position in the church. And there is no evidence that the Church of Rome had a bishop in the first generation, a single chair monarchical bishop. And there is no evidence that Peter had any role in founding the church. So all these are part of the chain of argument that the Catholic Church uses to justify the papacy. Peter was here, he founded the church, he appointed a single bishop, and then this single bishop began to be recognized as more and more as the leader of a wider circles of churches, eventually ended up in the formation of the papacy. That's the argument of the Catholic Church. Now, every single aspect of this chain of argument is historically flawed and theologically wrong, because there is no evidence in the Bible, and in history, this is more of a reconstruction than an accurate portrayal of what happened in real history. And so then, after that, there was the attempt to retrospectively try to look back into scriptures in order to find pointers to this process that had happened outside of scripture. And all of a sudden, they realized that they needed to go back to Matthew 16, go back to John 21, go back to Acts 2, all texts referring to Peter as the spokesperson of the apostles, or having had a role in the early community, early Christian community in Jerusalem, and finding these things as evidence of something that was already in place outside of biblical reasoning and development. And that has been it's in a way, it's the original sin of the papacy. The fact that It was proved outside of Scripture as the result of an historical process, and then
a reconstructive process, as you mentioned.
Giving rise to this very sophisticated argument, whereby with no evidence in Scripture, then all of a sudden we find a complete imperial system. So how do we square the fact that in the Bible, in the New Testament, churches were planted not in this imperial way, although there was a structure, but it was plural,
organic,
and adaptable. Whereas when the papacy was finally constructed and elaborated, it was a complete imperial, top-down, hierarchical, pyramidal structure that is not what we have in the New Testament.
So you were speaking about this gradual shift and change in the church. You spoke about the first generation, second generation, third generation church. Speaking in terms of centuries and years, where are we in history by the time we get to a structure in which there's a bishop that's recognized over maybe a geographic area of church elders who then, where are we in history?
Yeah, we are in the 2nd century.
So pretty early.
Okay. Yeah. 2nd century, we have these, the apostolic fathers like Ignatius of Antioch. Then in dealing with problems in churches, in realizing that there were heresies spreading around, and there were false prophets teaching false gospels, he says that we rely on the Bishop of Rome as our guide. That's one hint in the early developments of this recognition of the Bishop of Rome as exercising a role in defending, in being a reference point in the second and third generation of the church. And then you find other apostolic fathers beginning to talk about Peter as handing over his role of leader to the bishops of Rome. And you see that the problems that the early church was facing were dealt with in a way, in looking for a human authoritative structure to look upon in order to find resolution to controversies and problems. And then, the next stage was Irenaeus, again, in the context of contrasting heresies, using the argument of Peter establishing bishops in Rome as an apologetic argument, by saying that in the case of Irenaeus, he was dealing with the Gnostics, and he devotes the bulk of his work against the heresies in confronting these heresies from the Bible, giving evidence of a strong belief in biblical authority. And as a corollary, he also mentions the fact that what we believe, Irenaeus, according to the Bible, that's the foundation, that's the primary and test of what we say. As a corollary, what the Church of Rome teaches actually is exactly what we teach and what the Bible teaches. And so he uses this argument as a corollary, not as a primary evidence of the truthfulness of what he's saying, but in observing that in the Church of Rome, that was the kind of teaching that was taught, and it was not the Gnostic gospel, but was the biblical gospel. And so out of that reference, then we have the first list of bishops in Rome, Peter, Linus, and then the rest of the list.
This is 2nd century as well.
Yeah, right? End of the 2nd, the beginning of the 3rd. And that is the first historical list of names attached to bishops of Rome. And but again, even then, Irenaeus, with all due respect, he's is introducing a flawed historical argument when he says that the Church of Rome was founded by Peter and Paul. That is historically false. Irenaeus was wrong. And with all due respect, because nowadays we talk about the church fathers, we always have to say, oh, they are the church fathers. Yes, they were the first fathers, but they were fallible human beings making gross historical mistakes, and even sometimes theological mistakes, even damaging mistakes. In this case, Irenaeus was wrong. Historically speaking, the Church of Rome was not founded by neither Peter nor Paul. So that is a false statement. Mm-hmm. And even theologically speaking, and then Peter, as the Bishop of Rome, handing over to Linus, implying that even at the time of Peter, there was already a monarchical, royal structure. Mm-hmm. One bishop handing over the bishopric to one single person. That, again, is historically inaccurate. Mm-hmm. Irenaeus is making an inaccurate statement. And these statements are foundational for the self-understanding of the Catholic Church when it speaks about the papacy.
Mm-hmm. So, and just as a recap, like many things in Roman Catholicism, it's a development over time, and it's actually a reconstruction of history that doesn't necessarily or doesn't align with what the biblical evidence gives us. And I guess really in the end of the second century, early third, we see the emergence of this first list of popes or church leaders, bishops, and they were in an effort. For example, Irenaeus was saying it was in response to the Gnostics who were heresy in the church, saying no, we follow Peter in a sense, and if you follow Peter, you're part of the right church. So it was just this development over time and a reconstruction of history as we look backwards. Well, how so? Let's move a little bit. Let's address a different question. How exactly is a pope elected, and are there qualifications to be a pope? What is that? Yeah, who is the pope, and how does he become elected?
Oh, well, it's elected by the College of Cardinals, and the College of Cardinals is composed of those who previous popes have elevated to the cardinal position. So people who have expressed or have become prominent in church life, so to the point of being appointed as cardinal, they form this college. Roughly around there are the numbers of the college comprises roughly 120 electors. It's not a precise number, but that's the basic idea. And the idea is that they represent the apostles. The apostles were 12, and then they have put a zero after the two, so as to become 120, representing the apostles and representing the universal church, and electing the next pope. Mm-hmm. So previous popes, they do appoint cardinals who eventually elect the next one. So that's the kind of chain that has been going on for centuries. And up to Pope Benedict XVI, up to 2013, only once in history, the reigning Pope was succeeded by, after dying. Mm-hmm. So after dying, the new College of Cardinals was convened and the new Pope was elected. But Benedict XVI, as we all remember, he resigned, mm-hmm. and so he's still with us. So almost 8 years have passed, and he's still with us as an emeritus Pope. And so opening up a new a brand new position in the Catholic Church, living in the Vatican, still being white dressed with white robes, without the ring, the papal ring, of course, and without being called Pope, but being added Pope Emeritus, but still. So that's kind of a new thing for the Roman Catholic Church in its long history.
And this the Pope is elected at the Vatican and for life. And as you mentioned, it's elected by a group of cardinals, but the Pope appoints cardinals. And so that you're going to, Pope Francis, for example, has been busy appointing cardinals that would hopefully elect a new Pope eventually that would reflect his policies and his outlook on.
Yeah. Once a cardinal becomes 80 years old, he loses his electoral right. He still remains a cardinal, but he is not allowed to be part of the next election. And so there is always a rotation of new cardinals are nominated, and old ones, they move out the college and eventually they die. So at the present time, the majority of the electing College of Cardinals, or the electoral body of cardinals, has been named by Pope Francis. So usually popes, they do appoint cardinals, have like-minded bishops or archbishops or people of the Catholic Church, in order to charge them with the task of electing the next one. And so the papal election is always a kind of an open-ended, unpredictable thing. And there are, of course, there are bookmakers saying, "Oh, this one is more has more chances to be elected." But in the end, the College of Cardinals meets in the Sistine Chapel, and there's a very defined and structured procedure for the Pope to be elected. And in the end, the new one is selected and appears at the balcony of St. Peter's, giving the Urbi et Orbi blessing, the blessing to all, and being announced to the Catholic Church and to the world.
Does the Pope have to achieve any certain office to be eligible to be elected as Pope? I mean, a priest couldn't be. Does he have to be a cardinal before?
No, technically it could be also a priest, but practically being a cardinal is a condition to become a Pope. So the College of Cardinals elects someone from within. Technically speaking, it is not the only option they have, but practically that has been what I've been doing for centuries.
Once a pope is elected, immediately he inherits a bunch of titles.
Yeah,
there's a lot of titles that tied to the papacy, and each of those titles has very clear implications. And you mentioned these titles in your book. I just want to mention a couple of them. He is the Bishop of Rome. He's the Vicar of Jesus Christ. He's the successor of the Prince of the Apostles. That is the successor of Peter. He's the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church. He's the Primate of Italy. He's the Sovereign of the State of the Vatican City. He's servant of God's servants. But let's start with this title of Vicar of Christ. What does that mean exactly? And what are the implications of the title tied to the papacy as the Vicar of Christ?
It means that he sits in the place of Christ here on the earth. And I believe initially, as you mentioned in your book, it initially was the vicar of Peter, right?
Yeah.
But then obviously that changed to the vicar of Christ. And so, it just symbolizes that he actually represents physically here on earth Christ. He sits in Christ's place as the authoritative head of the church.
Yeah. And it's, as we talked about in previous episodes about the Christ Church interconnection. It's the embodiment of the physical human embodiment of the presence of Christ, the resurrected Christ, in his post-resurrection appearance. So the sacraments, the Eucharist is the sacramental presence of Christ. The Pope, in a way, embodies the physical human presence of Christ. And so to the point, then practically that doctrine was then developed into the doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope. So as a vicar of Christ, when he speaks ex cathedra, when he speaks exercising his magisterial teaching office and role, he speaks infallibly because he is the vicar of Christ. So it's not only a label that has no consequences, but it is fraught with issues and consequences. The infallibility of the Pope, the supreme monarch or of a state, again, stems out of that royal role as representing Christ, who is the King of Kings, and is the prominent prophet, as Christ is the prophet of God. The vicar of Christ speaks infallibly on certain occasions. And so it all makes sense in the context of the whole. As we often talk in this podcast, Catholicism is a system. It's not a bunch of isolated weird ideas or weird or less weird ideas, but it makes sense if you take it as a whole. Mm-hmm. And as a whole, it stands together, and we have to be aware of this interconnections that make Catholicism what it is.
It's interesting too, these two titles, the Vicar of Christ and also the Sovereign of the State of the Vatican City. So the Pope is not only the spokesman for Christ or the embodiment of Christ, but he's also the head of a state.
Yeah.
And so you have in one person both the head of the universal church, according to the Catholic Church, and the head of a state, so that when he travels, he's not only representing the church, but he's also representing a state, which is the Vatican. And if I'm not mistaken, is the only role. It's unique in the sense of there is no other role in which someone claims to be the spokesman of Christ, the embodiment of Christ, and also the head of a state.
Yeah,
which the implications there are.
Yeah, it is often overlooked. I mean, this dual identity of the Pope is often not appreciated as it should. We're not talking about a religious leader only. We're talking about a political leader with a small yet functioning, legitimate, sovereign part of the international setting. That adds to the Catholic Church a strong political element that, again, makes the Catholic Church unique in the context of Christianity. It's not yet another denomination, because no other denomination has a political state at the heart of it. No other Christian leader claims to be a political leader in the sense of being a monarch. But the Catholic Church does. And so it is often, especially in evangelical reflections on Catholicism, we think of Catholicism as, yet another way for the church to be denominated, and often overlooking the fact that we're dealing with a political entity as well as a religious entity. And the two are so intertwined that it makes no sense to appreciate one at the expense of the other. We have to take into consideration both. As you said, when he travels, when he visits the US or other states, he does so as a political leader, not as a religious leader. Of course, he's also the head of the Catholic Church, but he is welcomed and treated as a king or a president of a republic. And again, we parse this reality biblically. Can you imagine Jesus wanting to found his church as a state, as a government, as a political state? He founded his church to be his body, preaching the gospel, sharing the good news, serving the neighbors, administering the ordinances. But the magistrates, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, they belong to a different category. They are not roles for church leaders. And yet here we have the highest leader of a global church being also the sovereign monarch of a state.
It's very much active on the political field as well.
Yeah, behind the scenes, because there's no army, but there's a fairly strong financial power. There's very strong diplomatic force, and it is a state. It is a state. Mm-hmm. It's something that people often don't think about. It's a state with in the context of politics, global politics.
Let's mention one more title before moving on. He's also called the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church. Of course, the word for bridge in Italian is ponte, which comes from the Latin. So this is coming from the Latin. But basically the idea there is the Supreme Pontiff means the supreme bridge builder, or bridge builder, I suppose, in a sense that links God to man. So we've talked about this in the past as this idea that God reaches man through his church. Yeah. And so the church stands in the middle. And so the Pope is the supreme bridge builder between God and man. So sometimes we hear that word pontiff and we don't really, doesn't mean anything, but if you understand where it comes from the word bridge, and communicates this idea of being the vicar of Christ, obviously representing the embodiment of Christ. It would only make sense that he would be the bridge there between God and man.
It comes from it's an imperial title coming from the Roman emperors who were the only one allowed to build bridges over the river Tiber. And the title was assumed by popes and in a way spiritualized, in the sense of shifting the attention from real bridge building in over the Tiber to meaning that he builds bridges between the humankind and God, is the somewhat in between. And here again we see another historical process that has nothing to do with the Bible, and yet it is at the core of self-understanding of the papacy. Something that has nothing to do with Scripture. It has all to do with the Roman Empire, translated into Christian language, and embedded at the heart of the Roman Catholic vision.
Just a couple of questions left. In today's world, we're very politically correct. We want to be very careful how we speak about people or institutions. Now, when the Reformers spoke of the papacy, they didn't have that type of they didn't mince their words quite as much as we try to today to be careful not to offend. How has that, if we look back at how the Reformers viewed the papacy, how has that transpired over the centuries? How did they view it in comparison to how we speak about it today?
Yeah, well, we have. That's a very interesting topic, worth of having an entire episode. Yeah. But in a nutshell, Luther saw the papacy in a apocalyptic term. So he understood the papacy as being the institution through which or in which the Antichrist was actually exercising his role, and so he opposed it. Calvin had a more theological view of the papacy, still looking at it as the main opponent of the gospel, in the name of the gospel, in disguised terms, because that is the tricky thing of the papacy. It is not the enemy, or it is not the antagonist, clearly evidenced from the appearance, because it comes as the vicar of Christ. It comes in using biblical Christian language. It comes as a Christian figure, and yet he overturns, he undermines the very heart of the gospel. So they began to understand that in spite of what the papacy would claim, a deeper analysis was needed in order to grasp what was the root of that institution that was not at the service of the gospel, but in the name of the gospel was trying to suffocate it. And that has been the constant framework for post-Reformation theology up to the present day, when for a combination of factors, one was the one you were mentioning, our inability to stand for truth even when it is unpleasant to speak it out, and then the fact that our convictions have become weaker, so thinner, and so not giving rise to the courage to speak out, with gentleness, with love, but for the sake of truth. And the papacy has been now accepted as a legitimate form of Christian leadership, which is not, for the very reasons that we briefly mentioned before. In the name of Christianity, it undermines Christianity. In the name of Christ, he caricatures Christ. In the name of the gospel, it deviates from it. And this is something that we have to recover from, say, the reformers. They lived in a different age, of course, and so that not all the things that they said is accurate in terms of the papacy. Luther, in his later years, he was so preoccupied with these apocalyptic views that he went out of balance. But the root of it is to be retained.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's close with this from an evangelical perspective. So the papacy is not just something we dislike; it's something that or we disagree with, and so let's just go our separate ways. But why should it be, from an evangelical and biblical perspective, rejected, and why should an evangelical be very cautious about it? What is it? What is the aspects about the papacy that we as evangelicals should say, hey, biblically speaking, this is why we should reject it?
Yeah, because there is no biblical foundation whatsoever for such a high role. The highest role in the church is biblically flawed and untenable. And so if we give such a high credit to an institution which has no biblical foundation, then we end up in subverting the gospel. Secondly, it is an institution that not only has religious, theological claims, but also political ones. And that is also disturbing, to say the least, because there is always a political aspect in the papacy that is often overlooked. And then also from the, in the contemporary scene, people, they do tend to be attracted to whatever brings about unity. And the papacy has become even attractive to people who may dislike the idea of, theological idea of having a pope, or the historical record of the papacy. But they ultimately would say, well, in today's world, which is so fragmented, so divided, that we need someone who speaks out for the church. And the Pope is the best placed and suited man to do it. And for pragmatic reasons, pragmatic reasons, we tend to forget that we're actually accepting a kind of Trojan horse in our own thinking and reality. It's a role that has no biblical foundation. It has been against the gospel for centuries and still has problematic political overtones. And we should lovingly, respectfully, but biblically rejecting it.
In your book, you mentioned how Calvin had developed this idea of how Christ embodied a priestly, a kingly, and a regal role, and that the church, the local church, performs those roles in its community. But what we see in Roman Catholicism is that being represented in one single individual.
Yeah.
Is that correct? And I think that has a lot of implications too, is how we view the role of the church and our local church in our community, as opposed to seeing it delegated to one individual as opposed to the local congregation. Mm-hmm. Anything else we would say on? The last episode, Leo and I responded to some questions and answers, and we touched on, of course, this passage in Matthew 16 where Christ handed the keys, so to speak, to Peter and grants the authority to loose and bind. And of course, that is a huge verse that the Catholic Church uses to support the role of Peter as the first bishop. But we discussed how that actually came right on the heels of his confession as Christ as the Messiah, and based on his confession, the Lord not only gave him that authority, but also, as we see in John, the authority to the other apostles as well. But that's for another discussion, but you can go back and listen to that episode as well. But I think we can wrap it up now. We're probably gone over a little time, but a good overview to the papacy. Hopefully that helps you, our listeners, to understand the historicity of it, and where it came from, and what is implied by the office of the Pope. And if we didn't cover something that you really want to know about, send us a quick email, and we'll be happy to respond either in private or in another episode. Clay, what else we got?
Yeah, that's it. Just want to encourage our listeners to check out Leonardo's book, A Christian's Pocket Guide to the Papacy. Like Reed said at the beginning of the episode, you can find that on Amazon.com. You can also find the Audible version if you want to listen to it on your commute to work or at home, at your studies, wherever you find yourself, you can listen to it. Also, if you're a Logos user and an Accordance user, I believe, you can actually get this resource as well on those platforms, on those applications. So follow us on social media, Facebook at Reformanda Initiative, on Twitter at Reformanda Rome. Share this podcast, subscribe if you have not, and please leave us a positive review. That'll be very helpful as we continue to promote this resource to the evangelical world so we can be better united and equipped in order to defend the gospel and to reach our Roman Catholic friends. So if there's nothing else, I guess that's good.
Yeah.
All right. From Rome, God bless.